Once there was a shamus in Grodno who was lovingly called the Father of the Poor. Otherwise, he was known by the endearing name of Reb Nochemki. People loved him because he loved people. As the saying goes, one heart understands another. Reb Nochemki was small in stature, but he was a great scholar nonetheless. He was modest in his piety and valued kindness to people above learning. At first he did not wish to be a rabbi because he believed it would place him too far apart from people. "I'll be a shamus," he said. And a shamus he became in one of the synagogues of Grodno. He was constantly on the go with the trifling affairs of his calling. He cleaned the synagogue and made the stove in winter. He ran errands for the rabbi and collected money pledges for the support of his synagogue. But, in his spare time, Reb Nochemki scurried about town gathering alms for the poor. This task was no part of his duties as shamus. He did it out of his own free will and with burning eagerness. He had his own group of needy pensioners whom he supported as though he were their loving father and provider. Among them were widows, orphans, the sick, the hungry, and the abandoned. He distributed his help so unobtrusively and with such delicacy that no one felt ashamed. His duties at the synagogue were so numerous that only after it was closed late at night was he free to begin his alms collecting. In the most unseasonable of weather he was constantly seen, a bedraggled little man, trudging determinedly along the muddy or snow-banked roads to the various taverns, inns, and wine-houses of the town. He chose to frequent these places, for he used to say with a wink, "People who live for pleasure are generous with the groschen." Reb Nochemki would seat himself quietly among the card-players. He would banter them good-humoredly, and with merry quips would wheedle out of them a cut of their winnings. It was from these winnings that Reb Nochemki fed and clothed his precious flock of the needy. Late one night he went to sit among a group of card-players. They had no idea who the odd little man was and paid no attention to him. "What will you give me for my poor?" he asked them suddenly. Everybody laughed, for they did not understand what he was talking about. "I'll give you something, but nothing for your poor," said one of the card-players rudely. And right away he struck Reb Nochemki in the mouth with the flat of his hand, so that the old shamus began to bleed. To everybody's amazement, Reb Nochemki took it all good-humoredly, even with a laugh. "Very well," he said to the ruffian who had struck him. "You've given me something, brother. Now give me something for the poor." Touched by Reb Nochemki's gentle good humor, the gambler begged his pardon and gave him 10 rubles. There was nothing that Reb Nochemki wouldn't do for his poor. One day he was told that a rich Jew had arrived in Grodno and was lodging at a certain inn. So late at night, as was his custom, Reb Nochemki went to the inn. But to his distress he found the street door bolted. He knocked again, still no answer. What was he to do? The rich man might decide to leave early in the morning, and he might miss him. Being little and scrawny, Reb Nochemki went down on all fours. Then, flattening himself to the ground, he crawled through a narrow opening under the fence of the courtyard of the inn. Immediately a dog began to bark. A servant came out, and as soon as he noticed Reb Nochemki, he raised a hue and cry. "A gonif! A gonif!" When they finally caught the thief, they dragged the rascal into the light. They were struck dumb with amazement when they saw it was Reb Nochemki. "Reb Nochemki," stammered the innkeeper, "what on earth are you doing here? We thought you were a thief." "I've come to ask your rich guest for an alms," said the shamus. The innkeeper could not help himself, but had to go and pull the rich man out of bed. "It's our Reb Nochemki, who has come for your donation for the poor," he told him apologetically. The rich man was very much touched by Reb Nochemki's devotion to the poor, and he gave him a large sum of money. Reb Nochemki was a very sick man. He suffered from many serious illnesses. Nonetheless, he was never deterred by them from his labors for the poor, even in the worst of weathers. Late one night, as he was walking along a deserted road, he suffered a heart attack and fell unconscious to the ground. When he came to, he began to groan, and the sound attracted a passing wagoner, who lifted Reb Nochemki into his cart and began to drive him home. On the way, Reb Nochemki began to feel better. "Do stop and let me off," begged Reb Nochemki. "What's the idea, Shamus?" asked the driver. "You're in no condition to walk, you know." "I've a lot of people to look after." "But you're far too sick to go tramping about at this late hour." "Suppose I were to pay you to drive me through the dark forest at this late hour. Would you do it?" "Of course I would, Shamus. That's how I make my living. I have a wife and 5 children to support." "And I, my friend, have many more to support," replied Reb Nochemki, climbing out of the cart. Then he disappeared into the darkness. Reb Nochemki took great pains not to hurt the sensibilities of the needy whom he aided, for he was poor himself, and only too well understood the pride of the poor. One day he was asked to be godfather at a circumcision. Several days before the event, he made inquiry and discovered that the father of the infant was in bad financial circumstances and had no money for the celebration. So Reb Nochemki went to see him. "When, my son, are you planning to go to Kovno?" Reb Nochemki asked him. "Why Kovno, Reb Nochemki? Who's going to Kovno?" asked the man, astonished. "I thought that maybe you were going to Kovno," answered Reb Nochemki lamely. "And what if I was going to Kovno?" inquired the man curiously. "Well, if you were going, I wanted to ask a favor of you. I owe a man who lives there 25 rubles, so I wanted you to pay him for me." "But Reb Nochemki, how do I know when I'll be going to Kovno? I haven't been there for 2 years." "There's no particular hurry. The man can wait. Just the same, here are the 25 rubles, and the next time you go to Kovno, I'll be much obliged to you if you give it to him. On the other hand, should the money come in handy to you in the meantime, you're welcome to use it. You can replace it later." Unsuspectingly, the man took the 25 rubles and was glad. He spent the money on the circumcision party, and he was not obliged to feel humiliated, as he had feared all along. When Reb Nochemki arrived at the circumcision, the father said to him anxiously, "You forgot to give me the name and address of the man in Kovno for whom you gave me the money." "Let me see now," answered Reb Nochemki, as if trying to recall. "No, I'm afraid I can't remember. I have the name and address at home, and I'll let you know some other time." But this other time never came around, for Reb Nochemki said he had mislaid the address. After a while, the poor man scraped together the 25 rubles and returned them to Reb Nochemki. Once there lived a man whose name was Job. He built himself a roomy house that had 4 entrances, one on each side. He did this thinking, "When the poor and the hungry come, let them quickly find my door." Whenever a hungry man came, Job hastened to bring him food and drink. For these deeds of loving kindness to his fellow men, God blessed Job. He made him rich, and his fame spread throughout the land. Despite his good fortune, Job remained modest and pious as before. It chanced that a poor man died, and left behind him a helpless widow and many orphans. When Job heard of this, he said to himself, "I will go to the poor woman to console and to help her." At that very instant an angel of evil rose up before him, but he came in the disguise of one of Job's friends, so that the good man did not recognize him for what he really was. "I've heard," said the angel, "that you wish to comfort the poor widow whose husband has just died. I've hastened here to keep you from going to her." "Why do you come to mock at me?" asked Job. "How can you stoop so low as to visit the widow of a poor man?" cried the angel of evil. "You are the foremost man among your people, and its judge, and you must jealously guard the great dignity of your position." "Hold your peace," spoke Job sternly. "I will call on this widow, none the less. Do you think I am better than God, who comforts the widows and the orphans?" When the angel heard this, he departed. Job went to see the woman. He spoke words of consolation to her and her children. Afterwards he inquired from her neighbors whether her late husband had left her anything, field or vineyard. "No," they told him. "This man owned only a small field, which in recent years gave no yield." Job decided therefore to help the woman. When the 7 days of mourning were ended, he went to call on the widow and told her, "When you get ready to cultivate your field, I will send you one of my servants, also a he-ass and a she-ass to help you." "Far be it from me to accept aid from a strange man," she answered him. God, the Father of all orphans, will have mercy on me and my children. He will not abandon us in our need." "At least let me plant for you a vegetable garden," asked Job. But this help too she rejected. When sowing time arrived, the woman sold all her household goods. With the money she rented an ass and cultivated her field. But the results were disappointing. The ground gave forth only thorns and thistles. The poor woman and her children were obliged to go hungry that winter. When Job heard of her misfortune, he sent her grain to last her for a whole year, but she refused to accept it. "I will hire myself out as a servant," she sent word to Job, "so that I and my children may live by the labor of my own hands." The widow went to work for another, but her wages were far from enough to feed her and her children, so they continued to feel the pangs of hunger. When Job heard of this, his heart grew heavy, and he made a resolve. He let it be known far and wide that the widow was his own blood relation. When the people heard of this, they said, "Happy the man who will be lucky enough to marry this woman. He will inherit some of Job's wealth." And so it happened. A righteous man married the widow, and Job helped him with a lavish hand. The newly wedded couple lived in happiness and peace. Now it happened that many other men died during that time, and a great number of children became orphans. These too Job wished to help, but when he tried to give them food and clothing, and offered to sow their fields, they refused his aid. So Job said to his servants, "Take your tools and cultivate the fields of these unfortunates who don't want to accept my help. Should they try to prevent you, pay no attention to them, but go on with your work." When the servants of Job tried to cultivate their fields, the widows and the orphans arose to drive them away. "Who asked you to cultivate our fields?" they protested. Job's servants followed their master's instructions and paid no attention to them. In fact, they were obliged to resist them with force. The inhabitants of the countryside soon heard of the news. Then they spoke with bitterness. "What conduct for a pious man like Job! He has seized by violence the fields of helpless orphans. He ignores the rights of the people and does as he pleases. Indeed, he is not pious and good as we always thought, but a wretched hypocrite." In this manner Job was slandered, and no one esteemed him any more, as they had done hitherto. But when harvest time came around, the servants of Job gathered in all the crops and gave them to the orphans. Those who had reviled him before saw how unjust they had been to him, and they were very contrite. Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Joshua, and Rabbi Akiba traveled about each year in the land of Israel to collect money for the poor. Amongst their many and various contributors none gave more liberally, nor with more cheerfulness, than Abin Judah, who was then in very affluent circumstances. Fortune, however, took a turn. A dreadful storm destroyed the fruits of his grounds, a raging pestilence swept away the greater part of his flocks and herds, and his extensive fields and vineyards became the prey of his greedy and inexorable creditors. Of all his vast possessions, nothing was left him but one small plot of ground. Such a sudden reverse of fortune was enough to depress any ordinary mind, but Abin Judah, on whose heart the divine precepts of his holy religion had been early and deeply imprinted, patiently submitted to his lot. "The Lord gave," said he, "and the Lord has taken away. Let his name be praised forever." He diligently applied himself to cultivate the only field he had left, and by dint of great labor and still greater frugality, he contrived to support himself and his family decently, and was, notwithstanding his poverty, cheerful and contented. The year passed on. One evening, as he was sitting at the door of his miserable hut, to rest from the labor of the day, he perceived the rabbis coming at a distance. It was then that his former greatness and his present deplorable condition at once rushed upon his mind, and he felt for the first time the pangs of poverty. "What was Abin Judah?" he exclaimed, "and what is he now?" Pensive and melancholy, he seated himself in a corner of his hut. His wife perceived the sudden change. "What ails my beloved?" she asked tenderly. "Are you not well? Tell me, that I may administer to your relief." "Would to God it were in your power. "But the Lord alone can heal the wounds which he inflicted," replied the distressed man. "Do you not remember the days of our prosperity, when our corn fed the hungry, our fleece clothed the naked, and our oil and wine refreshed the drooping spirit of the afflicted? The orphans came round us and blessed us, and the widow's heart sang for joy. Then did we taste those heavenly pleasures which are the lot of the good and charitable. But now, alas, we cannot relieve the fatherless, nor him who wants help. We are ourselves poor and wretched. See you not the good men who will come to make the charitable collection? They will call, but what have we to give them?" "Do not grieve, dear husband," replied his virtuous wife. "We have still one field left. Suppose we sell half of it, and give the money for the use of the poor." A beam of joy spread over the good man's face. He followed his wife's advice, sold half the field, and when the collectors called, he gave them the money. They accepted it, and as they departed said to him, "May the Lord restore you to your former prosperity." Aben Judah resumed his former spirits, and with them his wonted diligence. He went to plow the small plot of ground still left to him. As he was pursuing his work, the foot of the ox that drew the plowshare sank into the ground. In endeavoring to relieve the beast, he saw something glittering in the hollow which the foot had made. This excited his attention. He dug the hole deeper, and to his great astonishment and no less joy, found an immense treasure concealed in the very spot. He took it home, and moved from the wretched hovel in which he lived into a very fine house. He repurchased the lands and possessions which his ancestors had left him, and which his former distress had obliged him to sell, and he added greatly to them. Nor did he neglect the poor. He again became a father to the fatherless, and a blessing to the unfortunate. The time arrived when the rabbis, as usual, came to make their collection. Not finding Aben Judah in the place where he had lived the year before, they asked some of the inhabitants of the village if they knew what had become of Aben Judah. "Aben Judah!" they exclaimed. "The good and generous Aben Judah! Who is like him in riches, charity, and goodness? See you yonder flocks and herds? They belong to Aben Judah. Those vast fields, flourishing vineyards, and beautiful gardens? They belong to Aben Judah. Those fine buildings? They also belong to Aben Judah." At that moment the good man happened to pass that way. The wise men greeted him, and asked him how he did. "Masters," said he, "your prayers have produced much fruit. Come to my house and partake of it. I will make up the deficiency of last year's subscription." They followed him to his house, where, after entertaining them nobly, he gave them a very handsome present for the poor. They accepted it, and taking out the subscription list of the preceding year, they showed it to him, saying, "See, though many exceeded you in their donations, yet we have placed you at the very top of the list, convinced that the smallness of your gift at that time arose from want of means, not from want of inclination. It is to men such as you that the wise king alluded when he said, 'A man's gift extends his possessions, and leads him before the great.'"